One of the most talked about factors nowadays when it comes to video games is the preservation of games as an art form and accessible media. Certainly an understandable concern, since we still see in real time companies straight up failing at keeping their games accessible, sometimes by their original development studio shutting down, usually by which of a parent company no longer seeing the value in them, or a game studio straight up not having their games available for modern audiences. Video games in particular are such a challenging form of media when it comes to the longevity of their accessibility. Other media like music, movies, and television already suffer from mishandled preservation. With this new age of AI restoration, we're really going to have to rely on those very familiar with the material in order to single out bad decisions to make sure the original work isn't being butchered in any way. Because I guarantee you, most casual consumers will likely not notice or even care, unfortunately. That's just how basic media consumption is for the most part. Games have so many variables at play when it comes to their preservation that no one person has a perfect solution, and I fear a perfect solution may never surface. With physical games, there's value to be considered like the actual cartridge or disc and the manual that came with the game, but these are ultimately insignificant, and the actual game, the raw product, the programmed data that we actually experience, is just a file stored within the physical media. This isn't to say physical media does not matter, absolutely not. Physical media may continue to be the best way to keep any software product preserved. In this current age of digital games risking getting delisted from digital stores or suffer availability through a subscription service, then physical released media is essential to make sure the pure contents of the game is safe and intact in a physical state, one liberated from the will of their creators who want to control their existence through these new distribution methods. In this way, games are very fortunate, as games were natively birthed in a digital format. The ROM file for old cartridge game systems, and the disk image file for disk systems, which can be easily dumped, copied, and well, preserved quite easily. All you need now is something compatible to run the ROM or ISO file. That is where the utility of emulators really show their virtue, as the original consoles aren't going to be sensible anymore when we're technologically moving so far away from those systems. Even if you get your hands on an original console, you will not be able to connect it to a modern TV. So you'll need a good quality scaler in order to plug your console into a newer TV. The consoles themselves are showing more and more wear as they age and might not be reliable unless you're capable of performing proper maintenance on them. Not much of a worry with emulation so long as it runs the game as accurately as possible. In this sense, I think the preservation of games is quite simple, both for developers wishing to distribute them and for new consumers wanting to experience them. It's how retro games are usually being accessed today, with retro compilations that can have an entire franchise easily available through a competent emulator. Services like Switch Online, while a consumer can never own the material due to the nature of a subscription service, the games are there, and they are available to you should you be interested at this moment. The tricky thing with preservation is that it's an ongoing pursuit. You don't just chuck a sealed game in a drawer or keep files in an old hard drive and say the game is preserved. They may be for a time, but anything can happen to make a physical game destroyed or a file becoming deleted. As generations pass, both fans and devs alike have to keep the games available as older generations fade in relevancy. If there was a perfect solution, I think we were close in a few examples. Nintendo's Virtual Console to me was such a simple and accessible way to keep their retro library readily available for newer audiences, only held back by the quality of the emulation itself, the total amount of games available, and keeping the games sensibly priced. Switch Online could still carry that mantle if Nintendo would simply let consumers purchase the games properly and not have them locked behind a subscription paywall. There is criticism to be had with making consumers repurchase a game if they own it on a previous console, something that the Wii U's Virtual Console suffered heavy scrutiny for. I think at this point, it's a mere fact of life that if you buy a game for one specific console, it's most likely stuck on that console. At least then, the games are fine, as long as the console still works. I still have my original Wii Virtual Console games from over 12 years ago. Just like an old physical collection, these digital downloads still hold nostalgic value because this was how I was able to experience these games growing up. despite being born way after their heyday. I could easily stick with these as my main way to play these games if I wasn't so compulsive to buy the same damn games again and again. It's in this way I think those Genesis games on Steam are the closest we've gotten to a perfect modern system for retro distribution. The emulator provided to play the game is just a given, and you're really only buying the ROMs themselves, and they're pretty damn cheap. Afterwards, the ROM file's all yours, and you can even use it on other emulators should you prefer to do so. It helps that Steam isn't restrained by console generations. Once a game is on Steam, it stays on there unless a developer delists it. But that's a criticism to be had for the dev and not so much Steam as a platform. Retro compilations are amazing in my opinion, but re-releases like these offer unique issues. What I mean is that when a retro game is re-released in this form, then the compilation itself becomes something that will have to be preserved. Sonic Mega Collection is one of my favorite retro compilations. Not because the emulation is fantastic, it's actually quite poor and I would recommend any newer release for these games. But the presentation surrounding the listed games is astounding. I love these menu designs and the included bonus materials from comic covers, trailers, artwork, and even the original manuals. The music especially is utterly sublime, and it turns this simple compilation into a Sonic time capsule that made experiencing these games to me feel just as special as when they were new, even though I grew up much later. All of this extra content is ultimately antiquated as the games themselves are the main attraction, and there are better options today for playing them, but the surrounding supplementary material is still valuable and deserves to stay preserved as well. These collections can also have minor tweaks. The Zelda collections on GameCube aren't the best, but remain as perfectly playable ways to play the included games. The same admiration to the presentation applies here too. The games are, again, simply ROM files stored on a disc, playable via Nintendo's very early emulation. What's fascinating though is that the N64 ROMs are altered to better fit a GameCube controller. References to the Z button in the original have been replaced with the L button, and the colors of the face buttons are changed, since that better aligns with GameCube controllers. This small tweak alone makes the ROM included with this release its own unique version that will have to be preserved. You can even use this ROM on an original N64 via a flash cart if you want. It's another heavy thing to consider with preservation, that so many retro games had multiple silent releases during the initial run. Before the age of modern software updates, games would still get updated but shipped and sold at a later date. I think it would be safe to say that these updates are so minuscule that it would hardly matter. But regardless, these updated versions are unique, and you never know when someone will find value in them. Most ROM patches for retro games seem to prefer using the very first release of a game, opposed to a potentially more polished version 1.2. I can't say for certain, but I would imagine devs would prefer to use the latest software release of a game for future distribution. I reckon that's the ultimate reason why the Shindo version of Mario 64 was used in Mario 3D All-Stars. Backwards long jump be damned. Back to Zelda for a second, the first game included an updated translation which would then be the basis for every Zelda 1 re-release going forward, lapsed the 2003 copyright. Metroid Prime's initial release had a glitch where you can skip to get the space jump boots right at the start of the game. Fans love this glitch as it opens up new routes to play through the game and alleviates some of the backtracking. This version also has a glitched form of the Flagra boss theme, looping every 30 seconds so you never get to hear the full theme. Future updated releases fixed the glitches, which fans hate because of the utility of them before. I'm not bothered by it, because the initial release of Prime would also suffer random crashes during elevator sequences, forcing a hard shutdown. Let me tell you, having to deal with that during my first playthrough, losing lots of progress every time it occurred, really sucked ass. Even for fans who miss the sequence breaking, there's nothing stopping you from simply playing that initial release on Dolphin. It's why emulation and game dumping is so important for the preservation of the countless versions of even one game. It may be easier to compartmentalize the preservation of a single game into whatever the best version of the game is. Today, each game has a multi-console release where the only tangible difference is mostly button prompts and other in-game references to whatever console the game is played on. In these cases, it would be sensible to dismiss such differences as console-specific UI and HUD design doesn't exactly impact the game in any meaningful ways. I would still advocate that even if changes are so minor and inconsequential, a console-specific version of a game still deserves to be preserved because you never know what other kind of content may be absent. I still hold on to the PS3 version of Resident Evil 5 just because it has PS Move support, and I do find the new controls to be quite fun and worth playing. The Switch version also has integrated motion controls that you will not find in other versions. The Switch version of DMC3 is the only official release with the updated style switching of the newer games. Spider-Man on PS4 still has a much better face model for Peter. Spider-Man the movie game on Xbox has an additional Kraven section. Shovel Knight almost requires you purchase every console version because there's pretty decent exclusive content for each one. I feel that no matter what changes, no matter how small or insignificant they are, any unique version of a game deserves to be preserved in its own right. Official re-releases should still happen, especially if devs and creators want to make money off older games. After all, people really do want to buy the games they really want to play within reason. But as any version of a game ages and ceases to matter in the general public eye, then specific versions will have to rely on good old piracy. Regardless of how you feel about piracy, it's the most sensible way to keep these versions readily accessible. Simply buying every game on a digital store and keeping them stored on whatever system they were purchased on doesn't make them preserved. It's a collective effort from countless gamers to keep games available. Especially when legal distribution is not possible for a game, piracy becomes the only viable option. For games as a raw product, I would encourage as many gamers as possible to have backup dumps of complete libraries for as many systems stored somewhere. It's more important now with ROM sites being constantly targeted and shut down. If every game was readily, legally, and indefinitely available for purchase on modern hardware, then maybe perhaps these piracy measures wouldn't be necessary. As it stands now, however, that's an impossibility, and so piracy becomes essential for the long-term preservation of these titles. You may not want to or have to partake in it yourself, but it is necessary. It's then up to gamers to still show their support by purchasing games when they are released. If you want a dev to see the game still has value, buy it. That isn't much of an issue for the most popular games. I can't imagine a world where it's difficult to play Super Mario Bros. 3. Nintendo will make sure this game is available no matter what. But that's not going to apply to more obscure games, unpopular games, or even games with closed out licenses or development studios. Those games must rely on piracy to stay accessible because companies probably aren't going to see the value in re-releasing them, or the companies won't even exist anymore. It's thanks to piracy I was able to play the original Yumi Kojo Doki Doki Panic on my NES via a flashcard and disk system emulation. It's very cool to have access to this game in this way, and while it's not completely authentic, it certainly felt close enough, and regardless, I'm glad I got to play it, and this game is still very solid and fun to this day. So that's a game as a raw product, the pure content of the game itself, playable on whatever format that will actually run it, whether it be emulation, original hardware, or FPGA hardware. There's also to consider a game as an actual experience. Games, of course, span so many different ways to play them. Games across the decades have seen unique ways of experiencing them, and preserving that particular experience can be something else entirely. This can range from the unique controllers to play the game to even the screen in which the game is displayed on. One reason I try to keep original consoles lying around is to have direct access to the original environment the game was originally played in. Not that it's totally necessary. Most games remain perfectly playable as that raw product on a newer, wildly different system. Retro gamers have always had this affinity for playing on CRT displays. I won't go into it much as there exists plenty of documentation of why it's probably preferable to play retro games with CRT visuals. The only problem is the actual CRT TVs. They're not that easily available anymore, and even if you have access to one, it's not sensible to have one in a setup unless you're willing to tolerate it. It's only fairly recently that filters designed to simulate a CRT have gotten really good. It's to my understanding that Cyberlab's Death to Pixels filters for RetroArch are the most advanced CRT filters today, doing an impeccable job at replicating the subpixel division and other such visual attributes of a CRT screen. There's also the RetroTink 4K, which can replicate a similar look thanks to having such a high resolution output that subpixel replication can be achieved. These new filters are so advanced that you can't even capture them properly because compression and lighting limitations can't be preserved through direct capture. You have to see these filters in person to actually see how authentic they feel. You can't expect devs to include such filters, as they are, to be fair, very finicky and heavily rely on a player's own tinkering to get it to look just right. The other aspect is controllers. Sure, most games from the past generations can be perfectly playable with a modern controller, but man, I don't know. It feels so weird to play NES games with a controller that has such a different form factor and a bunch of additional buttons and features. Playing Super Nintendo games with a DualSense feels equally off-putting. Not that there's anything inherently wrong with it, but the ergodynamics are still so different that performing actions just feels weird. Maybe not an issue if it's your first time playing and you don't have that muscle memory. But even still, there's an undeniable charm when you're playing a game with the very controller it was designed for. As much hate as the N64 controller gets, there's still no better controller to play N64 games. Those damn C buttons and unique analog stick just don't translate on a modern controller that well. It's why I'm glad Nintendo has these modern Bluetooth wireless versions that feel just as authentic as the originals. They're not cheap, and that's totally fair and valid criticism for not getting them. But for my personal use cases, they're worth it to me. Wii games can be tricky because of how they were designed around the Wii Remote and Nunchuck. Whenever playing on Dolphin, I only use real Wii Remotes and Nunchucks for that reason, and because they sync so effortlessly. I reckon split Joy-Cons may be very, very close, and they do work well for the Wii games that have been released on Switch. But even still, I gotta admit, I prefer playing with those original controllers. I have legit reasons that I'll save for later, but for the sake of this video, I'll say they just feel right. For many retro enthusiasts, the experience of a game can be limited to exactly how it was upon the initial release. I know I can make it sound like I have that same mindset, but understand I know how senseless it can really be. After all, it's not like you have to watch old movies on a projector or listen to old albums on a record player. For the original experience of playing an original game with the original format on the original console on an old-ass TV, while still perfectly achievable today, it isn't sensible. These old-ass games are getting rarer, and you can't ask a new consumer to spend hundreds of dollars on a used cartridge when the game could be available on a new console for much cheaper. Reproduction carts may help with that a bit, but I would not recommend repro carts. I'd advocate for a flash cart where you can dump ROMs and play games just like if it was an original cartridge, and there'd be no difference whatsoever. The appeal of an original physical copy is mostly nostalgic appeal, especially now when we have dickheads grading a game to artificially inflate its value when the true value lies in the raw product, the ROM file. I'll play with a flash cart if I don't own the game in its original format, but if I do, I will play it that way because I do see the charm in it. And because I'd rather actually play what I have and not let them collect dust on a shelf. There's also the experience of the original console. Again, mostly antiquated at this point. Emulators for many of these systems are so good that you wouldn't really miss out on anything if you play games this way. Modern FPGA hardware further closes the accuracy gap. I'd say if you want to have a dedicated physical device to play retro games, then get a Mister. I'd have one if I didn't already have the consoles I'd want to play. The consoles are merely the device to play the game, and with emulators and FPGAs, they aren't really that necessary anymore. Even if you want to play the original cartridge or use a flash cart, there are products like the AVS and analog products that fill that niche. There is an issue of scarcity, and features may be absent like analog output for CRT play. I think affordable clone systems could provide an excellent option for many gamers. Clone systems from the past were based on crappy Chinese clones of original chips, so games wouldn't play as good. With FPGAs able to mimic the original hardware far more accurately, I think affordable clone systems of basic features and connections could have their place as original systems are getting older and more rare. I am aware of console mods, but I'm sure not every retro gamer is a hobbyist wanting to dissect an old console. Not that I have a problem with it, all of my consoles have been modded in some way, but I'll admit if I didn't have them initially, then I'd probably hesitate to bother getting them in favor of modern, more convenient alternatives, as long as they run the games as accurately as possible. In the realm of VR, there's EmuVR, which seeks to capture the experience of a childhood bedroom playing retro games. The littlest details, from inserting cartridges into consoles to plugging the consoles in and playing on a virtual CRT, all of which are customizable. I haven't tried it myself, but I do think there's something truly special to accomplish here. You can also view this in a more depressing tone. The idea of grown adults trying to replicate a childhood gaming bedroom in a virtual reality space would probably make most people raise an eyebrow. But I don't know. I see the potential and utility when it can make light gun games perfectly playable in a relatively accurate way to the original. I look forward to trying it myself and seeing how it advances in the future. Between the various ways of looking at it, I think it ultimately is the smartest way to just look at games as a product and not get hopped up on experiencing them in a very specific way. Probably hypocritical of me to say if you've seen some of my other videos, but understand I'll always forever preach to play a game however the fuck you want. Games are meant to be fun, and whatever it takes for you to have the most fun with the game is all that matters. Probably the current most contentious form of game preservation is remakes and remasters. Lately, we've seen so many forms and perspectives of remasters and remakes that it can be hard to even differentiate the two. To get it out of the way now, my ultimate hot take is that regardless of how faithful a remaster and remake are to their original, their creation never preserves the game. They do make a version of a game purchasable for modern audiences, which is fantastic and the entire point. But I wouldn't say any official re-release in the form of a remaster or remake keeps the game preserved. Because of any changes or alterations, the very being of a remaster or remake becomes another thing to preserve. If any content from the original is not accessible in a remaster or remake, then I couldn't see them as a historical replacement for the original. Surely a playable replacement, but the content of the original will always hold more historical value in this topic of preservation. If we're all being completely honest, most don't want a game to get remastered or remade because they want the game preserved. It's because gamers want to see changes that may improve the game as a playing experience, and there's nothing wrong with that. I love seeing games getting touched up or even remade, so long as it's not seen as a replacement to the original. The only way I can say a remaster or remake truly does preserve the game in its own way is if the original is included as a playable option. Metroid Zero Mission is mentioned all the time because it's such a good example, but also something like Castlevania The Dracula X Chronicles is equally admirable. The game is already a very faithful remake, but even the drastic changes it makes is easily glossed over just because the PC Engine original is included. There are still changes in the same vein as an updated ROM release, but it's nothing more than that. There are cases where a remake is necessary in order to redistribute a game. The Crash N. Sane trilogy pretty much had to go through the remake treatment in order for these games to see new light for modern gamers. Sure, the originals are still available on the PS3's PSN store, but they're not available on PS4 and beyond due to Naughty Dog not owning the Crash license anymore. It's unfortunate licensing issues like these that can prevent games from even being distributed for legal purchasing. Vicarious Visions couldn't go the basic remaster approach, so they had to remake everything from complete scratch. The result is a remake that is pleasantly faithful to the originals in story, gameplay, and controls. It's why they'd rather have these games be identified as remasters and not remakes, because they should play identically to the originals. In that sense, I'm okay with these versions essentially replacing the originals for modern times. For how long though is yet to be determined, since the Crash license is back in limbo, so these versions may also have to rely on piracy, just like the originals before them, in order to keep them playable. For the most part, I'm okay with a remaster or a remake of a game replacing the original in modern distribution, because piracy keeps the originals preserved when the devs can't. People like remasters since those can basically be described as touched up versions of the same game, so technically no content should be lost and the rest of the game's actual content can suffer from a poor transition. I'm not aware of all of them, but the DMC trilogy, Ratchet trilogy, GTA trilogy, and I reckon several more have remasters that can suffer from a tampered art style, missing effects, graphical bugs, glitches, and other such anomalies because most of them are, unfortunately, a quick and dirty transition just to port the games to a new system. It's gotten so bad that I've seen PS2 fans admit they'd rather see PS2's originals re-released in the form of emulation playback. I heard of a new PS2 emulator in development for PS5, so who knows, that might be what they do in the future. A perfect example of a remastering to me would most certainly be Metroid Prime Remastered. Because it still uses the original source code, simply ported to a new engine, then it would technically be more of a remaster than an actual remake. Many would still argue otherwise because Jesus Christ, the graphical touch-up is downright insane. You just don't see this kind of effort put into what's basically nothing more than a graphical overhaul. Other remasters would simply settle for new textures, and you all may already know how I feel about that. Prime Remastered, however, circumvents all of that by having every single graphical asset appropriately updated while still keeping every visual aspect of the original intact. Having all the narration options from all the regional versions, every control option including the pointer controls, and new twin stick controls, makes me a lot more comfortable with Prime Remastered replacing the original if it were to ever be redistributed again. Full remakes are usually and thankfully seen as inherently separate entities. Remakes are weird since while remasters are usually seen as the same game as the original, remakes can take on many different forms. The Resident Evil remakes have gone from staying very faithful to the original to the point where it has replaced the original, to being quite faithful for the most part but still changing many gameplay aspects and excluding various content from the original, to being a remake in name only as it's fundamentally a completely different game to the original and not really comparable at all, to being shockingly faithful to the original, updating the gameplay in sensible ways, while ultimately still not replacing the original, again from just how fundamentally different they are in execution. This kind of weird remake spectrum that gamers have been arguing for years has only made the value of the originals more apparent. I'd encourage all gamers to never see a remaster or remake as a replacement to the original, rather a supplement to the original. Then I'd encourage all gamers to at least try an original if they could, because there's always something to enjoy or experience that may not be present in a remaster or remake. No matter how faithful a true remake is, it still has its own identity, independent from the original. It should be treated as its own thing and only serve to complement an original, not to replace it. Many original games still hold up just fine. I think modern gamers would be surprised at how perfectly playable they are, as long as the actual playing isn't compromised in any way. At most, many retro games only need the smallest of touch-ups. It's in this way I find retro ports to be quite fascinating. We've seen examples of these sprinkled here and there. Honestly, the only modern example I can think of at the moment is the Sonic Origins collection. Sonic fans have spoken of very rational and logical problems with this collection. It's by no means perfect, but the very nature of these versions being enhanced ports rather than a basic emulation makes these versions more tantalizing. It's not the first time the Sonic series has seen this. The Sonic Jam collection on Sega Saturn is the same way. The games aren't emulated, they were properly ported to Saturn. That alone makes these versions more interesting, but outside of that, they play one-to-one identically to their originals. Sonic Origins is more of a remaster then, with widescreen and some modern gameplay tweaks. Updates that I certainly appreciate, like the removal of lives in favor of tokens that you can use to retry special stages, or purchase bonus unlockables in the gallery. Die-hard fans still have valid issues like certain gameplay and controls not translating completely accurately in these new versions, or the absence of Sonic 3's original Michael Jackson soundtrack. All totally fair, and another reason to see the Origins versions as their own separate entity. They will still probably be how I go back to the original Sonic games, simply because I do like what's updated and don't notice the more underlying issues. Frankly, my biggest issue is that the classic versions in this collection aren't true original versions due to them maintaining the updated physics, which can cause various gameplay hitches. Perhaps it would have been better and more acceptable for fans if they were a straight emulation instead, with a patched Sonic 3 ROM to remove the MJ music. Sega delisting the Genesis Sonic games from Steam is still a complete dick move just to boost the value of the collection, which only further shows the value of an original release if it's much more affordable, and the worth of a remaster to validate a higher price with meaningful updates and enhancements. The other form of retro ports that's been a new thing recently is decompilation and recompilation projects. This seems to mostly be a fan effort, but I can imagine devs and publishers considering this in the future. The basic gist of a decomp or recomp is taking an original game, the ROM file, and running it through a compiler to break down the code, reconstruct it, and then have it be executable on newer hardware. In this case, a PC. Now that's probably a gross and even inaccurate simplification, so if you're interested, feel free to look into it yourself. But the end result is an original, retro game now accessible through a simple .exe file, and it's treated like its own program, a proper port if you will, one not limited by the bounds of emulation. It all started when Mario 64 got decompiled, leading to the infamous Windows port that was then so effortlessly ported to any device you can think of. Several games have received this treatment, and it's quite exciting to see for each game. A Link to the Past is one I've been trying, and it's quite fascinating to be sure. There's a whole bunch of updates and tweaks you can apply to the game without the need of installing separate ROM patches. You can create your own tailored version of the game that suits you best. Not gonna lie, some of these tweaks are pretty nice. The widescreen works as well as it could with the inherent 4:3 limitations. The HD map is really nice on the eyes. A more robust item system alleviates the need for only one item button. Being able to turn while dashing is just fine with me since it was featured in the BS Zelda Satellaview sequel. It's all very nice, and I'm more than happy to pick and choose what updates I actually want. See, with emulation, using enhancements, while really cool, usually comes with a caveat of sorts that may require further tinkering and fixing. Basic things like widescreen and sprite games can require a whole dev cycle to properly implement without bugs or issues. Frame rate patches may work 80% of the time, but can cause speed issues in other areas that feel unpolished. But with a decomp or recomp, these games are no longer bound by that restriction, and enhancements can be done much easier with fewer to no issues. Ideally. I'm aware that further fixes still need to be done on the development side, but for a consumer, then these enhancements can be as easy as a switch of a setting. The new Zelda 64 Recomp has my favorite overall integration of a retro game port so far. It's a simple installer where you can mess with some options before even starting the game. Then, once the game boots, you can still access the options menu and quickly tweak whatever you like in real time. The way these settings are presented is key to making this recomp far more convenient and approachable compared to standard emulation tweaking. Being able to use a controller to change settings and seeing the settings change in real time without the need to perform a reset is awesome. The Link to the Past decomp has a boot up window, which is your only chance to change settings, and it's a little inconvenient since you have to use keyboard and mouse. The thing I value most about these versions is that you can still get an original experience by simply not using any of these enhancements, similar to not using emulation enhancements. These ports also run so much better, way beyond what's possible via emulation. It might not be that noticeable, but load times are cut even shorter to before, which is awesome. If preservation is the name of the game, then nothing about the very original should be absent. I would honestly like remasters a lot more if they'd simply have options to not use whatever enhancements they bring, in case I or anyone else think the enhancement detracts more than it adds. Something that these ports allow, which to me is awesome. These new retro ports are very exciting to see as an evolution of traditional emulation. Emulation will always be fantastic, but I feel for the general gaming experience, for casuals especially, then these new compiled releases may prove to be a more preferable way to play these games. At least from what I've played, I'd rather play a decomp or recomp than go through emulation. It ultimately leads to a much simpler process that I find very appealing. I would call these recomps serviceable replacements to the originals since there isn't any missing original content within them. It's the same with ports of modern games. In ways, I almost prefer a straight port over a remaster, as they'd be devoid of the bugs and other caveats that come with a remaster. You can just play the newest release and trust it'll be the best version that isn't missing anything from the original. Since I couldn't really fit this into any other spot, we've also seen complete fan recreations of some retro games. Not emulation, not even decomps. Straight remakes, in a way, of retro games by fans. The only two I'm aware of is Metroid Planets and the Link's Awakening PC version. These are complete fan recreations of these games. While they're certainly fascinating, all I'll say for now is that they don't replace the originals in any way, either due to too many changes or alterations. They're remarkable substitutes if you felt the originals were too dated, but like any other faithful remake, they stand with their own identity without replacing the originals. And what I mean is that you couldn't use these versions as reference material if you're referring to the original, but that doesn't negate or discredit the admirable work done here. Metroid Planets was actually pretty damn fun, and I ended up beating it by complete accident because I couldn't stop playing. Though it still ultimately feels like a different game when playing it. I would actually love to see fan remakes of retro games in this style, opposed to these Unreal Engine tech demos that are perhaps too ambitious for their own good, and usually end up unfinished and never see the light of day. These two feel and play like finished games that act as tasteful updates to a retro original. As they stand, they do not replace the originals, but may be a preferable version to play for newcomers. Regardless, retro gaming and the preservation of retro games is in a pretty good spot, I'd say. Even though officially we're still at the mercy of devs who can shut down projects at a moment's notice. As long as fans remain tenacious to keep these beloved games available, then I think we have nothing to worry about. Right now, there are so many options to play retro games, all of them valid in their own way, whether it be from going completely old school to reliable emulation to even remasters or remakes, or these fan compilation efforts. Play whatever appeals to you most, so as long as you're having fun. My current wish is hoping for RPC S3 to get to the point where I can play the gold edition of Resident Evil 5 with those exclusive PS Move controls using Joy-Cons or some shit, at higher frame rates thanks to emulation enhancements. Seems crazy now, but shit, I bet it'll be possible in time. I think that'll do it for this video. Sorry if most of this video seemed like senseless rambling. I'll try to keep the next one on the shorter side for both our sakes. I just had quite a bit to talk about this topic since it comes up from time to time, usually when a studio shuts down fan projects or shuts down themselves. I think for the most part, we can rest easy that any game you would ever want to play will most likely be quite easily accessible to you if you're not harped on piracy. Whatever path you choose, I still stress the importance of buying and supporting the games you actually enjoy. Worst case scenario, you'll end up legally owning the games you love and won't have to rely on piracy to play them. But don't feel shamed if the game is legitimately unavailable. I would like to thank those who stuck with it this far. Again, I'll try to keep the next video as short as possible. As far as what it'll be, you'll just have to wait and see. Either way, I think that'll do it for me today, so I just want to say thank you for watching.